Douglas Mawson's body hung suspended in thin air, a rope cinched around his waist and blood dripping down his gloves. During a 1913 Antarctic expedition, the 30-year-old geologist from Antarctica had fallen into an ice crevasse in sub-zero temperatures. Here he was alone, frostbitten and half dead. The wind above him howled, swinging him back and forth as he watched his frayed rope breaking piece by piece. The only thing that stopped him from falling further was a sawed-off plank of wood jammed across the crevasse just wide enough to stop his fall. And if he fell, it would have been the end. As if this wasn't bad enough, before this, he had gone through literal hell, trekking across the endless Antarctic, completely out of supplies and without shelter. He was in a race against time to catch a ship that was his only chance of making it home to his fiancée, Paquita. If he died here, she would never know what happened to him. This thought drove Mawson to fight for his survival. This is a story of sheer determination and a will to live. Some have called this the greatest survival story in history. So stick around, because you're not going to be disappointed. Before he was clinging to life on a rope, Douglas Mawson was a rising academic. He was a geologist by training, and he was said to be kind of a book nerd and someone who was very precise. He was not the kind of man that you'd picture starving on the edge of the world. But only a few years earlier, he had actually joined Shackleton's Nimrod expedition. He had already walked across the Antarctic ice and helped reach the magnetic South Pole. And when Captain Robert Scott invited him to join the next great dash to the pole, Mawson had actually turned it down. He wasn't interested in fame or planting flags like many explorers he had encountered. What he wanted was data. Rocks, maps, weather readings, and a better understanding of the vast, empty space that sat at the bottom of the world. He believed that Antarctica wasn't just a blank spot on a map. It was a place that could teach us something, so he decided to raise money, recruit men, and plan his own expedition. This time, it would be Australian-led. It would be purely about science. Ultimately, 31 men would set sail with him, and no one, he told them, would be left behind. Before the expedition set sail, Mawson got engaged to a young woman named Paquita Del Prat. He had met Paquita while working in Adelaide, where her father was the general manager of a company. She was fluent in several languages, quick-witted, and by all accounts, strikingly beautiful. The two of them promised to wait for each other. He told her he would be home by the end of the next year, and she believed him. Before he left, she gave him a small bag packed with personal comforts, a scarf, a fruitcake, and a handwritten note. He tucked it away with his supplies, never imagining how much it would one day mean. His ship, the Aurora, was packed with everything they thought they might need. There were supplies for multiple base camps, along with a team of scientists, engineers, and survival experts. They brought crates of pemmican, dried biscuits, powdered milk and cocoa, some basic foods that could help them survive the cold. To keep them warm, they packed lots of wool clothing, sleeping bags made of reindeer hides, and enough kerosene fuel to keep them warm as long as they needed. To help them with the arduous work ahead, they brought dozens of sled dogs that also became their companions. The Aurora departed on December 2nd, 1911 from Tasmania, Australia. And after weeks at sea, the Aurora finally pushed through the pack ice and the crew could finally see the Antarctic coast. And immediately they could tell the real work was about to begin. It was January 8th, 1912 when the Aurora reached Commonwealth Bay. As the ship edged through the pack ice, the men spotted a rocky headland rising above the frozen shoreline. It was one of the only places where they could actually unload supplies without risking damage to the vessel. They chose this site to actually be their main base and named it Cape Denison. As they began ferrying their gear from the ship to the shoreline, the weather turned almost immediately. The men used lifeboats to shuttle crates across the water, but the waves and the winds made it nearly impossible. In the weather, some of the boxes were lost to the sea even before they touched land. At one point, Mawson actually had to plunge into the freezing water and recover one of their only stoves. Other equipment that fell into the water ended up being shattered against the rocks or lost to the sea forever. As it turns out, Cape Denison, where their main base was to be set up, actually happens to be one of the windiest places on Earth, and gusts there can reach over 200 kilometers an hour. They built their shelter by carving into the rock and anchoring it with everything they had. Most of their time, especially during the first few weeks, was spent just surviving and waiting out the weather. And when the blizzards finally eased, they began organizing the real scientific work. The expedition was split across 3 key locations, each with a distinct role. The main base, Cape Denison, would serve as the scientific hub and be led by Mawson himself. From here, there would be multiple sledging teams that would fan out and explore the uncharted interior. Far to the west, a second team would establish a camp on what was called the Shackleton Ice Shelf. That group was actually led by somebody called Frank Wild, who was a survivor of Shackleton's Antarctic expedition. And then a third crew would be back on Macquarie Island, where they would set up a communication station to relay information between Camp Denison and the mainland. At the main base, Mawson's sledging parties were each given different missions, and Mawson, he would lead the most ambitious of these journeys. His team would head farther east than any group had ever gone. It would be dubbed the Far East Party. He would take with him 2 men, Belgrave Ninnis and Xavier Mertz. Ninnis was a British Army lieutenant responsible for the dogs. He was quiet, disciplined, and methodical. Mertz was a champion Swiss skier and a mountaineer. He was strong, cheerful, and unshakably loyal. They took with them 16 dogs, 3 sledges, and enough supplies to last them 6 weeks. The plan was simple. They would strike out across the glaciers, gather data, and be back by the hut in early January. If something delayed them, they had a hard deadline, because the Aurora was set to return in February, pick them up, and return back to Australia. And if they missed it, they would be stuck there for an entire year. Knowing that, they still packed their gear, loaded the dogs, and stepped off into the white, not knowing their journey was about to descend into a frozen hell. It was November 10th, 1912, when Mawson, Mertz, and Ninnis actually departed. For the first several days, the surface of the ice was manageable. The dogs would run strong, the weather held, and the sledges moved quickly over the firm snow. They made 300 kilometers in the first 3 weeks, and Mawson noted in his journal, "We made a splendid run today. The dogs ran furiously." But soon the terrain would begin to break. They were entering the interior edge of what's now called the Ninnis Glacier, though they didn't know its name yet. Crevasses became a daily threat. Some were narrow and shallow, while others hid beneath thin crusts of snow. Mertz would often ski ahead and scout the surface, while Ninnis managed the dogs on foot. Mawson would be navigating from behind, taking compass readings to make sure they stayed on course. The sun glare off the snow actually became unbearable for the men. They did everything they could to stop themselves from going snowblind, including putting soot under their eyes and wearing smoke glass goggles. It just wasn't enough, because each morning they woke to aching heads and blurred vision. In his diary, Mawson wrote,
"We are slightly snow blinded, and in the evenings we suffer much from headaches."
Now, at night, to stay warm, they would pitch a single tent, anchoring into the ice using snow blocks and axes. They slept 3 across in the tent using their sleeping bags to stay as warm as they could. They would melt snow for water using what's called a Primus stove, which ran on kerosene and essentially became their source of life out there because there is no wood to burn. When the wind would die and the dogs settled for the night, Mawson sometimes let his thoughts drift to his fiancée back home. It was a reminder that someone was waiting thousands of miles beyond the ice, and the thought of not returning to her troubled Mawson deeply, especially knowing the dangers that laid ahead of him. During the journey, meals were short and mechanical. Hard biscuits and hoosh, a stew made, well, from the pemmican and hard biscuits. Just add water and there you go, it's hoosh. They had to measure food for the dogs by the ounce because they had just enough to last the full journey. Now, during this type of work, these guys are burning almost 10,000 calories a day. By early December, they were well beyond any mapped territory. They crossed 2 massive glaciers and recorded new coastal features no one had seen before. Mawson wrote, "We had gone further than anyone east of Cape Denison." During this time, morale seemed to remain high, even though their fatigue was growing day by day. At this point in the journey, their fuel was running a little lower than expected, and the dogs were losing weight. And to make things worse, the weather started to turn. Originally, the plan was to continue on for a few more days and then circle back towards the Aurora. But by December 14th, past a shallow rise in a glacier where everything came undone. Just want to say thanks for joining in today. If you happen to like the story or the channel, If you happen to like the story or the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and if it's not for you, just enjoy, and maybe we'll see you again. I won't waste any more of your time, so let's move on. It was mid-December, and the team had been traveling along the edge of a glacier. The weather seemed to be taking a turn for the worse, and the men were unsure whether or not they should circle back at this point. Now, Mawson and Mertz were ahead of the rest of the group, with their skis gliding over the snow. Behind them, Denison was walking beside the third sledge, the one that was carrying the most food, the tent, and 6 of the strongest dogs. And without warning and without a sound, the ground beneath Denison collapsed. A hidden crevasse, masked by a thin crust of snow and ice, swallowed him whole. The dogs and the fully loaded sledge vanished with him in an instant. Mawson turned back just in time to see the emptiness where his companion had been. He and Mertz scrambled back to the hole and fell to their knees, shouting Denison's name into the abyss as loud as they could. But there was no reply. There was no sound but the wind. The crevasse, they estimated, was about 150 feet deep. The edges were smooth and sheer and vanished into the darkness. They could make out fragments of the sledge, shattered across a narrow ledge. Somehow, 2 of the dogs had survived the fall and would respond with a bark every time they called for Denison. One of them laid still, while the other one could be heard whimpering, but there was nothing they could do to get to the dogs, the sledge, or Denison. Despite yelling for Denison for hours, he never responded. It seems like he had died upon impact. And unfortunately, slowly, they heard the last whimpers come from the dogs as their injuries claimed their lives as well. With Denison gone, their hearts were heavy, but things were much worse because Denison had died with all the food and gear they needed to survive. Their largest food stores, the tent, and their warmest sleeping gear were all in that sledge. They even had lost the map cases that marked their route back home. Now, here they were, more than 500 kilometers from the nearest human being, and between them, they only had about 10 days of rations. Now here they were, just 2 men with the 9 surviving dogs, no shelter, no hope of rescue, and no choice but to turn back and head to Cape Denison. Now that choice to turn back wasn't an easy one. Mawson was a driven man. He had planned this journey for years. He dreamed of discoveries and map routes that no one had ever attempted before. But without the gears and supplies, pushing forward would mean certain death. Returning became their only hope, and they set out immediately. And unfortunately, the weather got even worse because the wind picked up again and the temperatures dropped. And slowly, in these harsh conditions, the already starving dogs began to fail one by one. The first to collapse was shot. Its meat was shared between the 2, but there wasn't a lot of fat or meat on these dogs to begin with. Then slowly, another dog, and another. Eventually, they even killed some of the weaker dogs to help feed the stronger ones. The trail behind them was marked by shallow pits and dark bloodstains. Survival often demands cruelty, and to be honest, they probably really didn't have a choice but to kill each of the dogs. But what they didn't know was that the livers of Greenland huskies carry dangerously high levels of vitamin A, and the men were trying to use every part of the dog to sustain themselves, including the liver, which contained the highest levels of vitamin A. Mertz, who was a near vegetarian, had trouble stomaching some of the tough dog meat and began consuming more of the liver that was softer, but within days, his health collapsed. His gums bled, his legs blistered and peeled, and his hair started to fall out. Mawson watched helplessly as his friend spiraled. First, he became quiet and withdrawn, and then he started to panic and even became delusional as his fever soared to temperatures that Mawson couldn't believe. The men had no idea what was causing this illness, but Mawson could only guess it was likely going to be fatal. But Mawson tried everything to nurse him back to health, feeding him whatever little bits of food they had, wrapping him tightly in reindeer skins, rubbing his hands and feet to keep the blood flowing, but unfortunately, Mertz kept slipping. And on January 8, 1913, Mertz would die in his sleep. Mawson sat alone in his tent, frostbitten and skeletal, staring into the white silence, knowing he was finally completely alone. He buried Mertz under the snow with a crude wooden cross made from broken wood from the sledge. That night, he opened his journal and wrote not as a scientist, but as a man who desperately wanted to make it back to see his fiancée, Paquita. And he wrote,
"My thoughts have been with you constantly through the whole journey. I shall always be true to you, dearest girl."
He knew that if he died, maybe his journal would be found and Paquita would know he was thinking of her. Mawson was the last man alive, with no shelter, no partners to help him, no dogs, his feet frostbitten so bad he could barely walk, and to make things worse, the rations were so low he was now literally starving. He had 100 miles of hell that still laid ahead of him if he wanted to make it back to the Aurora. At this point, Mawson wasn't just fighting for survival, he was racing a deadline. If he didn't reach Cape Denison by early February, the Aurora would depart without him, and with it, his only chance at rescue. The next relief wouldn't arrive for an entire year. He literally had less than 30 days to make it there. And there was only one hope to get him there. It was that there was emergency supply depots that might be along the route, because weeks earlier, when they set up the base, the main party had placed small emergency caches at intervals along the eastern route. They were meant as a backup for future expeditions. No one expected Mawson would need them now, alone and desperate. The caches weren't well marked, and Mawson didn't have a map. Some could have already been buried by snow, while others he might have walked past, already missing them entirely. But he knew if he could find even one, it might give him just enough energy to keep him alive another day. Now, the sledge at this point that he had was way too heavy to haul on its own, so he took a lot of the gear off of it. At this point, his hands were raw and cracked. As he tried to re-rig the ropes, they would bleed. And without ceremony, he began crawling back across the glacier, day after day, hour after hour. And when I say crawling, I don't mean figuratively. He was literally crawling for a lot of this journey at this point on his hands and knees because his feet were so broken he could barely walk, and the ice was so slippery and dangerous, it was the only way he could move forward. The first days were a blur of white pain. After 10 miles, he collapsed in the snow, only to force himself back up. By 20 miles, he had reached the edge of a ridge he thought he recognized, only to realize it was in his head. At one point, he accidentally headed west when he didn't mean to, and every extra step that he took was punishing his body because he just didn't have enough calories to sustain himself, and every little bit of energy counted more than he realized. The skin at his feet was literally peeling off. I couldn't imagine what he was going through. He, luckily though, somehow was able to navigate his way because he still had a compass and a sextant. But despite that, he couldn't predict what would happen next. As he was crawling along inch by inch, suddenly a thin layer of snow beneath him gives out and he falls into a crevasse. Immediately, he feels the harness that he was wearing from the sled go tight and he feels himself stop dead. Somehow, his sledge had jammed across the ice gap above him, which ended up being the only thing stopping him from death. Mawson dangled in the void, the same black emptiness that had taken Dennis just days before. He clawed desperately at the rope, trying to haul himself upwards, his frostbitten fingers barely able to grip the rope. But somehow, inch by inch, breath by breath, he pulled himself out. He immediately collapsed on the surface, his hands shaking and gasping. After that, he created a rope ladder and tied it around his waist, which he carried with him everywhere. This way, if he fell again, he'd at least have a second chance. Walking was starting to become so painful because his boots were worn, and his feet were falling apart. I mentioned earlier that his skin was peeling off, and when he takes his boots off one day to look at them, the entire soles of his feet were literally hanging off of the foot, hung on only by a tiny bit of skin. He didn't know what to do, so he simply pushed them back on and bandaged it up and shoved his feet back into his boots. He forced his body forward, not just to live, but for the promise he had made to Paquita to return. The geological samples that meant little to him now, but he was determined to take them with him if he could. He figured, at least maybe if he could get them back to Cape Denison, Dennis and Mertz wouldn't have died in vain. Crawling along though, he was only averaging a few miles a day now. It was slow and agonizing. But he crawled on, and by late January, Mawson was significantly behind schedule. He marked each passing day in his journal, watching February draw closer. He knew the Aurora wouldn't wait forever. He was still over 30 kilometers from base, and he moved like he was a ghost, staggering, skeletal, his feet rotting inside his boots. His only hope was a place called Aladdin's Cave. It was a small supply depot that was dug into a rock 8 kilometers from Cape Denison. It was the final depot before home, but he knew it was full of supplies. He started to recognize some of the terrain around him, so he knew he was fairly close, and he began to scan the horizon desperately. And unbelievably, he sees a mound, and he knows it's got to be Aladdin's Cave. He clawed and crawled his way closer, and he was right. It was the supply cache he'd been looking for all along. Immediately, he crawls inside and collapses on the ground, exhausted. Inside that frozen cave, Mawson still couldn't believe he made it. Here, there was rations, and as he rifled through them, something made his blood run cold. It was a note. The depot team had passed through, leaving behind some supplies just in case Mawson was alive. And at the bottom, he read the date, and his jaw dropped. It was dated February 1st, in the morning. It had been left there just hours earlier, and the snow around the site was barely disturbed. They had missed each other by a whisper. It also stated that the Aurora was scheduled to depart as planned, and now Mawson knew that in his state, he would need all the luck in the world to close the distance and make it home. He sat motionless in the cold, his fingers trembling until he noticed a small bundle wrapped in cloth among the supplies. He opened it. Inside, a silk scarf, a bar of chocolate, and a letter. The handwriting was Paquita's. She had given it to him before the expedition. A gesture of love, something to hold on to if he ever needed comfort. He hadn't taken it with him. He left it behind at the base, but his teammates, hoping he might still be alive, had placed it in Aladdin's cave, and somehow, her gift found its way back to him. It was as if it had waited here just for this moment. He pressed the scarf to his face. It still carried her scent. He read the letter she had given him before he left, which said,
"I'm longing to see you again, and do take care of yourself."
He broke the chocolate with shaking hands and began to weep. He gathered himself as quickly as he could, though, because he knew he had to make one final push to catch the Aurora. He knew that he could make it in one day if luck held out and he really pushed himself. But unfortunately, Mawson and luck don't live in the same universe. A sudden blizzard pinned him inside the cave for days. No fire, no warmth, just ice, wind, and his body, which was already on the edge of collapse. He had to claw daily at the snowdrifts that would block the entrance so he didn't become trapped. He was desperate to get out of there because he knew that the ship might already be leaving. And then, on February 8th, the skies finally cleared. Unfortunately, he knew that this was the day the Aurora was scheduled to leave. Mawson knew this was his last chance. If he didn't move now, he'd be trapped in Antarctica for another year or die trying to escape. He clawed his way out of the snowbound cave, his body failing, and began the final 8-kilometer march towards Cape Denison. Meanwhile, at that base, there were 6 men who were making final preparations, packing tents and loading equipment. A long silence hung over the camp because they knew Mawson should have been back by now. And that's when one man turned and froze. He could see a figure on the horizon. He couldn't quite make out what it was. They knew they better run and find out what it was. There was no words, no plan. They just went. And there, they found, buried in the snow, Mawson. His skin was cracked, he was nearly frozen and half buried in snow. But his words to the men were painfully clear. And he said, "I suppose I'm too late." And that's when they told him that the Aurora had left just hours earlier. The 6 men that were at the depot had actually chosen to remain just in case Mawson returned. Somehow, though, against all odds, Mawson actually had a camp to go back to, and he wasn't alone for the first time. So he stayed at the depot, frostbitten skeletal, and slowly being nursed back to health, knowing full well he was there for the next year. But at least he had warmth, shelter, and companionship. And when the Aurora finally returned the next December, he boarded in silence, carrying with him the weight of 2 graves and a journal with a story that would go down in history. And back home, Paquita was waiting. And just as they promised each other, they were reunited. They embraced, and this time, she didn't let go. They married as soon as they could and ended up spending decades together in Adelaide. Mawson rarely spoke of what he endured, but his name was etched into maps, monuments, and the very identity of Antarctic science. He should have been one of the most famous men on the planet after this expedition, but unfortunately, the World War would break out and his story would fade out. His wife did his best to keep it alive, but Mawson rarely wanted fame anyway. But through all the years, one image stayed with him. When he was dangling by a rope alone in the crevasse, he could have let go. He didn't climb out for fame and not for survival. He climbed out for Paquita. It seemed that his love for her was truly the drive for him to make it home. What a fucking amazing story. He didn't just survive Antarctica, he almost conquered it in a way that I guarantee in 100 years from now, this story is still going to be talked about. And clearly it's not talked about enough. I had to dig deep to find it. But I do think as time goes on, more and more people are going to hear the story, and I can't see how there's not a movie about it already. And if there's any filmmakers out there, I don't know, listen to this, make the movie already. Thanks again for joining in, guys. It's been a great episode. I love this story. I hope you liked it too. And I'll be back with another great story in a week or two. Thank you.